welcome to my channel. From time to time, the king of monsters emerges from the ocean depths, or wherever he has been hiding out for the past few decades, and stomps around Tokyo or some other major city. In his many appearances on the big screen, we've seen him grow and evolve and adapt, along with our special effects technology. But exactly how much has changed? To answer that question, here are 10 things all Godzilla fans should know about the monster abilities science. How big is Godzilla? As far as we know, Godzilla is an ancient animal. Like all living creatures, he's undergone natural selection and evolution, but also mutations caused by human activity. This means there's no single, truly accurate depiction of what he's supposed to look like, which is good news for us because it means Godzilla has grown quite a bit since he first appeared back in 1954. The original was only about 50 meters tall, but today's Godzillas can measure more than 100 meters. That's almost twice as big. It would be pretty cool to see a giant monster roaming around today, but just how much damage could it really do? Well, not as much as you might think. See, they're only about twice as tall. Godzilla isn't actually as heavy as you might expect. The biggest one ever made was the 2021 version, which measured 120 meters high and weighed only about 87,000 tons. That's just over 63 times heavier than a fully grown African elephant. So while he'd definitely destroy a lot of buildings and probably crush a few cars, if he accidentally stepped on them, he wouldn't be able to flatten entire cities like we see in the movies. For that, he'd need to be even bigger, maybe like the size of an iceberg. The science behind Godzilla's atomic breath. Speaking of atomic weapons, Godzilla is famous for breathing superpowered fire. We're talking intense enough to melt steel and vaporize people. He also emits an aura of radiation that's dangerous to anyone nearby. But how does this work? Can we make a real-life version? The short answer is yes, but it would require developing new physics, or finding a way to harness existing physics that we do not yet understand. One possible way would be to build a device that uses nuclear fusion like the sun. Right now, humanity is trying to do something similar with tokamak reactors, but until we figure out how to sustain a reaction long enough to generate more power than goes into it, it's probably not going to happen anytime soon. And then there's antimatter, which releases huge amounts of energy when combined with regular matter. Unfortunately, it's also extremely rare and expensive. We don't have much of it, and it's hard to store. Still, if we had a bunch lying around, it would be easy to imagine a device that shoots it out in a concentrated beam. Maybe instead of either fusion or antimatter, we could use gamma rays. These have enough energy to break chemical bonds and change substances at the atomic level, meaning they could turn whatever they hit into plasma, effectively creating a miniature star. Not easy to do, but certainly possible. And then there's the question of putting it all together. We have the physics figured out, but building a device that can focus and direct these energies is harder than it looks. No one's ever done it before. But if we can solve the problems of sustained fusion, antimatter containment, and gamma ray generation, we may be able to build our own atomic breath sometime in the next century or two. Godzilla's strength and durability. Okay, but let's say we managed to make a Godzilla. How strong could it really be? Well, thanks to the laws of physics, not as strong as a real dinosaur. Since dinosaurs went extinct 66 million years ago, evolution hasn't had a chance to make any new ones, meaning anything that looks like a dinosaur today is a fake. That includes the original Godzilla, which was designed to look like a T-Rex, albeit with more spikes. Modern Godzillas aren't technically dinosaurs, although they still look kinda like them, with their massive jaws and thick tails. Instead, they're officially classified as reptiles. Specifically, these are the same type of dinosaurs that inspired the very first Godzilla. In fact, the name itself comes from the Greek word for terrible lizard. Of course, it's debatable whether the ancient Greeks were referring to lizards that grew to 100 meters in height. But hey, we're gonna roll with it. Anyway, since dinosaurs went extinct so long ago, we have to rely on fossils to get an idea of what they were like. Unfortunately, most of the best preserved fossils are from small animals. There are virtually no complete skeletons of sauropods. This is partly because they were so big. Their bones were basically the size of tree trunks and took hundreds of years to fossilize. But it's also because they lived during a time when scavengers were few and predators were even scarcer. Basically, there were very few animals big enough to kill a sauropod, and those that were capable usually focused on the smaller dinosaurs, leaving the giants mostly intact. Even so, fossils are incredibly useful. For example, scientists discovered that some species of sauropod could weigh up to 70 tons. That's nearly 10 times as much as the biggest Godzilla. Now, obviously, Godzilla is radioactive and maybe that gives him super strength. But even if he could somehow lift 10 times his body weight, which no other animal can do, he'd be completely exhausted after just a few minutes. That's because the amount of energy required to lift that much weight is enormous. An average person couldn't hold their arm up for more than a few seconds. So it is safe to say that even a superpowered Godzilla would be able to match the strength of a real dinosaur. Could a real-life Godzilla exist? Speaking of dinosaurs, there's one thing we have to address here. Some people believe that dinosaurs never really went extinct, that they evolved into modern animals like birds and crocodiles. But this is a myth, or at least it's only partly true. While it's true that birds descended directly from theropods like Velociraptor, they're not related to sauropods like Brachypod. Sure, they both belong to the group called dinosaurs, but they're like distant cousins, more closely related to each other than either is to us. So if birds aren't dinosaurs, could they evolve into a creature that looks like Godzilla? Well, it's possible, but only just barely. That's because the closest living relatives of sauropods are turtles and crocodilians, which is kind of weird. Birds are also reptiles, but they're closer to turtles and crocodilians than they are to dinosaurs. Evolution doesn't always move in a straight line. Sometimes whole groups of animals go extinct, forcing closely related species to take on new roles and fill their empty niches. So if birds were to evolve into a new giant sauropod, it would have to be very, very different from its ancestors. That means no feathers, for one thing, and it would probably need to grow teeth, claws, and a tail. In other words, it would be a literal chimera. While we haven't seen anything like this in the fossil record, it's not impossible. It would take millions of years and some pretty crazy mutations, but it could happen. How Godzilla's regeneration works. Speaking of mutations, Godzilla's radioactivity also gives him amazing healing abilities. In fact, he's almost immortal. After being mortally wounded, he's regenerated his entire nervous system, heart, lungs, bones, and skin. Even when his entire body is irradiated and mutated, he's still able to recover. And it's not just because he's big. Smaller animals like salamanders can regenerate limbs, tails, and even parts of their hearts. But as animals get bigger, regeneration gets more difficult. Lizards can't regrow their entire bodies, nor can dogs or horses. So how does Godzilla do it? Well, there are two possible answers. One is that he has special cells called stem cells that allow him to rebuild his body from scratch. Stem cells are undifferentiated cells. That means they haven't yet become bone or muscle or brain tissue. They're basically raw materials. When activated, they begin dividing and eventually turn into whatever they're supposed to. Another possibility is that Godzilla regenerates his body by growing it back from the inside out. That might sound weird, but it's not impossible. In fact, scientists recently discovered that mice can do something similar. They found that after injury, some of the mouse's blood cells migrate to the wound site and transform into new cells that grow the rest of the body. So whether he uses stem cells or turns his blood cells into other types of cells, Godzilla is literally rebuilding his body from within. Is he just a monster? One of the craziest things about Godzilla is that he's smart. Not only can he learn and adapt to new situations, but he can also plan ahead and come up with clever strategies. He's shown incredible problem-solving skills, figuring out how to use his environment to defeat enemies or escape danger. He's even demonstrated the ability to feel emotions like anger, sadness, and grief. So is he just a monster, or is there more to him? Well, the truth is, we don't know. In the original movie, Godzilla was depicted as a force of nature, something that humans couldn't control and ultimately had to accept. But as the series progressed, he became more intelligent and developed more human-like qualities. Today, he's considered to be more of an anti-hero, a powerful force for good that just happens to destroy a few buildings every now and then. But where did this come from? Well, it's hard to say. In a sense, Godzilla's intelligence is just another one of his adaptations. It helps him survive and reproduce, so it's been selected for over the years. But it could also be evidence of something more. A sign that he's more than just a mindless monster. Maybe there's a spark of consciousness in there somewhere. Godzilla versus dinosaurs. Speaking of intelligence, the original Godzilla was designed to look like a dinosaur, but it wasn't very accurate. It had thick armor plating, a thick tail, and a tiny head with disproportionately small arms. None of these features are found in real dinosaurs, but they do appear in a lot of fictional monsters. So why did they put them on Godzilla? Well, it's probably because they thought it would make him scarier, but in reality, it just made him look more like a turtle. Still, the design team did draw inspiration from real animals. In particular, they wanted to evoke the image of a moat. These were giant marine reptiles that lived during the Cretaceous period. They were perfectly adapted for life in the water, with paddle-shaped limbs and huge tails that could propel them through the ocean at incredible speeds. Although they looked like dragons, they were more closely related to snakes and lizards. Could they really fight? Now that we've established that Godzilla isn't as strong as a real dinosaur, let's take it a step further. Say we created a super powerful lizard that's twice as tall and weighs 10 times as much as an African elephant. Could it really fight a sauropod without getting utterly crushed? Well, not only could it would absolutely destroy it. But that doesn't mean we'd be safe. After all, the real world isn't like the movies. So could Godzilla and a sauropod really fight without destroying everything around them? Well, the answer depends on what they're fighting over. Sauropods were herbivores, so they probably wouldn't attack unless they felt threatened. That means Godzilla would have to provoke it in some way, like stepping on its tail or something. But if a sauropod decided to attack Godzilla, it would be in serious trouble. Unlike sauropods, Godzilla's entire physiology is geared towards hunting. He's fast and agile and deadly. It would take him a while to catch a sauropod, but once he got his jaws around its leg, there would be nothing the poor dino could do about it. But the real danger would come afterwards. You see, the reason why dinosaurs went extinct was because they were too big. Back then, the planet was warmer and food was more abundant, so gigantic animals thrived. But as the climate cooled and forests gave way to grasslands, bigger animals needed more food than was available. Eventually, they ate themselves into extinction. So even if Godzilla could beat a sauropod in a one-on-one fight, he wouldn't be safe. Eventually, he'd run out of prey and die of starvation. Godzilla in space. While we're on the subject of what else could kill him, it's worth pointing out that space is full of dangers that Godzilla could impossibly hope to overcome. Radiation, extreme temperatures, meteorites, poisonous gases, and even microgravity. None of this stuff could kill him in a few hours, but over time, it would drive him insane. Luckily, this has never happened. Godzilla has never left Earth, or has he? Actually, it's been done a few times. In 1995, Godzilla was sent to outer space to stop a hostile alien invasion, and in 2004, he traveled to a parallel universe filled with kaigas and monsters. But perhaps the strangest journey into space was in 2016 in Godzilla, Planet of the Apes. Part 1. Godzilla and a few thousand humans travel to a distant planet in search of a new home. However, they encounter a civilization of intelligent apes who don't want them there, so Godzilla has to teach them a lesson. What would happen if Godzilla attacked in real life? Finally, we come to the question on everyone's mind. What would happen if Godzilla really existed and decided to attack a major city? Well, to answer that question, we have to pretend that he's not radioactive. If he were, it would be pretty bad. We'd have to evacuate entire countries and maybe even continents. But assuming he's just a giant mutated lizard, he'd cause absolute havoc. The first thing he'd do is knock down a lot of buildings, probably thousands of them. And if he kept walking, he'd crush even more buildings. He'd also destroy bridges and roads and anything else in his path. We could try to stop him with conventional weapons, but that wouldn't do much. He'd probably just shake them off like a dog trying to get rid of fleas. At that point, our only option would be to nuke him. The problem is that if he survived, he'd be even angrier than before. And if that happened, it would be a long, hot summer for whoever he decided to visit next. Click here to watch one of these next videos and let us know in the comments section which fictional monster you'd like to see us cover next.